The storm that swept across Winthorpe Vale that night was unlike any other, a moaning, restless wind that seemed to carry with it the ghosts of the fallen. The gates of Winthorpe Manor groaned open after 3 long years of silence, and the clatter of hooves on wet stone broke the rhythm of rain that had haunted the estate for far too long. Inside the carriage sat a man once hailed as the pride of the North. Alaric Winthorpe, Duke of Clybourne, returned from the battlefields of France. His eyes, once bright as winter skies, had dulled to the color of ash. His uniform, though tailored for a duke, still bore the bloodstains of war, faint but stubborn, as if refusing to wash away. The hand that rested on his cane trembled ever so slightly, not from weakness, but from memory. The footman stumbled as he opened the door, startled to see the Duke alive. "Your Grace, we thought—" Alaric stepped down without a word. His boots sank into the mud, the wind clawed at his coat, and lightning flashed across the valley, illuminating the sprawling manor that awaited him. It stood proud yet hollow, its windows dark, its heart long asleep. He had left this place with a vow carved deep into his soul. Never again would he love, never again would he give his heart to fate. The last woman who had held it, Lady Marian Fairley, had died before his very eyes, her name slipping from her lips in a whisper he could never forget. Love, he had decided, was a cruelty disguised as grace, and he would never bow to it again. Yet the house did not know of his vow. It breathed again as if in recognition, the servants rushing like ghosts reborn. Candles flickered to life in long-forgotten halls, fires stirred in the hearths, and above all, in the small chapel at the rear of the estate, a single flame had never gone out. Lady Evelina Winthorpe knelt before that flame. She had been doing so every night for 3 years. The first year she prayed for his safety, the second for his peace, the third for a miracle. And tonight, as thunder cracked across the moors, she whispered the same words she always did, words that had become both her comfort and her curse. "Bring him home, Lord, and if he returns to me without love, let me love enough for us both." She did not know that her prayer was being answered at that very moment, that the man she loved more deeply than he would ever know was stepping into the same storm she had faced alone all these years. When Alaric entered the grand hall, his footsteps echoed like an old memory. Every portrait along the corridor seemed to watch him, silently judging. The scent of lavender lingered faintly, the same one she used to perfume his letters before the war. He paused by the hearth where once they had sat together on their wedding night, a marriage arranged but not entirely without hope. She had tried to speak of dreams and children, he had spoken only of duty. Now he felt the weight of his right, solitude pressing in on him like a curse. The housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, curtsied low. "Your Grace, Lady Evelina will be overjoyed." "Tell her not to trouble herself," he interrupted quietly, removing his gloves. His tone was clipped, emotionless. "I am in no need of celebration." But when she turned to obey, he hesitated. The words tasted bitter. For a moment he almost asked, "Is she well? Does she still wait for me?" But the words never came. Upstairs, Evelina rose from her prayers and pressed a trembling hand to her chest. She thought she'd imagined it at first, that strange sound from below, that familiar echo. Then she heard it again, the deep, steady rhythm of boots on the marble floor. Her heart stopped. When she reached the staircase, her breath caught. There he stood, soaked, scarred, and changed beyond measure, yet unmistakably him, her husband. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He looked up slowly. For a heartbeat their eyes met, hers wide with relief, his hollow with disbelief. Then, in that fragile space between them, thunder struck again, shaking the very walls. And just like that, the Duke who had vowed never to love again had come home to the woman who had never stopped praying for him. The morning after his return, the manor stirred uneasily, as though the very walls were uncertain whether to rejoice or mourn. Word of the Duke's survival spread quickly through Winthorpe Vale. The villagers rang bells, candles flickered in windows, and the chapel that had long been half empty filled once more with whispered prayers of gratitude. But inside the manor itself, gratitude was a fragile thing. It clung only to one heart, hers. Lady Evelina Winthorpe woke before dawn, as she had done every day since the war began. Habit guided her feet to the small chapel at the far end of the corridor, a place worn smooth by years of her kneeling. Her nightgown trailed softly across the stone floor. The air was cool, fragrant with beeswax and faint smoke from the candle that had burned without pause for 132 nights. She knelt, folding her hands, and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling with the rawness of relief. "He's home." Her lips trembled on the word home, for though he had returned, she could not yet call him that. The man who had stepped through the manor doors was not the husband she remembered. He was something colder, quieter, a man carved from shadow and frost. Still, she prayed. She had made a promise long ago, not to God but to herself, that she would never stop believing that love could heal even the deepest wound. When she rose and walked through the hall, she noticed the small traces of his presence. His coat draped over the banister, his boots by the fire, the faint scent of gunpowder still clinging to the wool. Her heart twisted. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, to tell him he was safe, that he was home, but her courage faltered when she thought of his eyes. The night before, those eyes had met hers only once, and in them she had seen neither anger nor affection, only distance. At breakfast, the servants moved cautiously. No one spoke above a whisper. When Alaric entered, the room fell utterly silent. He was dressed not in his ducal attire, but in the plain dark coat of an officer, his hair unkempt, his expression unreadable. Evelina rose, hands trembling slightly. "Good morning, Alaric," she said softly. He nodded once. "My lady." The formality of the words stung. They carried the chill of winter, the sound of a wall being rebuilt. She poured him tea anyway, the way she had done before he left. Sugar, 1 spoon, a touch of lemon. She remembered every detail he once preferred. He accepted the cup without looking up, his eyes fixed on the window, where rain fell steady against the glass. "Did you rest well?" She tried again. "Rest is for the unburdened," he replied flatly. The words silenced her, but only outwardly. Inside, her resolve held. Later that afternoon, while he walked the grounds alone, she lingered by the window, watching him. The wind tugged at his coat as he crossed the courtyard, tall, proud, but impossibly solitary. The man she had married had been quiet but kind. This man was neither cruel nor gentle. He was unreachable. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, came to her side. "My lady, he needs time. The war takes more than land and men. It takes their sleep and their hearts." Evelina nodded faintly. "Then I shall wait until he wakes." That evening, she prepared the same supper she'd made the night before he left, roasted pheasant and honeyed bread. She remembered how he'd smiled at her awkward attempt then, how his laughter had been the last sound to fill this house before silence took it. Now she waited again, seated across the table from his empty chair. When he finally entered, he paused, startled perhaps by the sight of the familiar dish. She offered a faint smile. "I thought you might like this again." He hesitated, then sat. For several long minutes they ate in silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, his hand brushed the edge of the folded napkin beside his plate. Inside, he found a note written in her delicate hand. "You once told me war makes men forget what peace feels like. Let this home remind you." His jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the note far longer than he meant them to. When he left the room, Evelina exhaled a single silent prayer. "Please, let him feel it again. Even if not for me, let him feel peace." And somewhere deep inside the fractured heart of Winthorpe Manor, a single ember stirred, faint but real. The Duke had returned, yes, but the man she loved was still lost within him. And she, the woman who waited in prayer, would not rest until she found him again. By the 3rd day of his return, the manor had grown accustomed to his silence, but Evelina had not. She followed him with her eyes as one might follow a ghost, afraid to speak, afraid to break whatever fragile thread still bound him to this world. Alaric Winthorpe moved through his home as if it were enemy territory. Every door creak made him flinch. Every portrait seemed to accuse him of survival. He had seen too many die. Soldiers who trusted him, men who laughed one night and bled out in his arms the next. What right did he have to come back when so many had not? He entered his late father's study that afternoon. the fire long cold, dust gathering on the Duke's untouched books. In the hearth hung the same painting that had watched over him since childhood, the Winthorpe crest, a falcon in flight, bound by a silver chain. It had once stood for duty and strength. Now, it only reminded him that freedom was something he'd never known. The weight of command, of titles, of ghosts, all pressed against his chest until he felt the air leave him. He closed his eyes and heard the sound again. Cannon fire, a man's scream, the pounding of hooves. His breathing faltered. "Your Grace?" came a soft voice from the doorway. Evelina. She stood with her hands clasped before her, wearing a simple lavender gown that caught the last gold of afternoon light. He turned away instinctively, unwilling to let her see what the war had left behind, the tremor in his fingers, the broken rhythm of his breath. "You should not enter this room," he said, voice low. She hesitated. "It was once your favorite place. I thought perhaps it could be again." He gave a dry laugh, one that sounded more like bitterness than mirth. "Favorite places burn away when men go to war, my lady. I learned to prefer the trenches. At least there, the dead don't look disappointed." Her eyes softened with pain, but she didn't retreat. "Then let this room live again," she said quietly, "if only to remind you that not everything that dies must stay dead." He finally looked at her, really looked, and for a fleeting moment the wall between them cracked. He saw not the dutiful wife chosen for him by his father, but the woman who had waited, prayed, and kept this hollow house from collapsing into ruin. "You prayed for me?" he asked, almost as if disbelieving it. "Every night," she replied, "even when they said you'd fallen, even when they buried your men and left your name among the lost." He swallowed hard, his throat burning. "Then you wasted your prayers." "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I never stopped. Because if there was even one part of you left to come home to, I wanted it to find the light." The silence that followed was heavy, not empty, but full. He turned sharply, his cane striking the floor. "You speak as though love could resurrect what war has buried. It cannot, Lady Evelina. I am not the man you married. Whatever you prayed for, it is not me standing before you. Now." She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She only took a single step forward and said, "Then I shall learn to love the man who returned." For the first time since he had come home, Alaric couldn't breathe. He wanted to tell her that she deserved better, that her faith was wasted on a man who had forgotten how to hope. But the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he turned away, gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles whitened. Evelina lingered a moment longer, then quietly placed something on the table, a folded piece of parchment. "It's from the vicar," she murmured, "a prayer for peace. I thought you might like to read it." When she was gone, he stood in the dim light, staring at the letter. He did not open it, but his hand trembled over the seal, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the urge to kneel. That night, as rain whispered against the windows, the Duke who had vowed never to love again lay awake in his bed, listening to the faint sound of her voice drifting from the chapel below. She was praying again. And though he would never admit it, the sound of it, soft, steady, full of faith, made the emptiness in him stir like something long buried, remembering how to breathe. Winthorpe Manor was a house that remembered. Every wall, every staircase, every echo of its long corridors seemed to hold the breath of the past. When the Duke walked its halls, the floorboards groaned not with age but with memory, the kind that clung to the soul and whispered, "You are not alone." But Alaric Winthorpe had made solitude an art. Each morning he would rise before the sun, take his coffee in silence, and retreat to the study or the west balcony overlooking the moors. The servants had learned not to speak unless addressed. Even the clock seemed to tick more softly, as though the house itself feared to disturb him. And yet, he was never truly alone. Because Evelina was there, not in his shadow, but in the spaces between. He would find fresh flowers in the hallway vases, their scent faint but sweet. His boots, which he left muddied by the door, would be cleaned before dawn. And in the library, the candle he forgot to extinguish at night would always burn low, its wick trimmed neatly by morning. He never saw her do these things, yet he knew it was her. Quietly, Persistently, she was keeping life inside a house that had forgotten how to live. It unsettled him. One afternoon, as the sun sank over the western fields, Alaric wandered into the old ballroom, a place he hadn't entered since the night of his engagement to Lady Marian, long before Evelina. Dust lay thick over the marble floor, the chandeliers shrouded in cobwebs. He paused by the grand piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. He remembered Marian there, her laughter like chimes, her fingers dancing over those same keys. He remembered the melody she'd played for him the night she died, when her carriage overturned on the cliff road. The last note had never left his head, and then, faintly, impossibly, he heard it, a single note, then another. He froze. The melody drifted softly through the air, hesitant, fragile, but unmistakable. Someone was playing her song. His pulse thundered. He turned sharply and found Evelina standing at the piano, her eyes closed, her hands trembling over the keys. She gasped when she saw him. "Forgive me," she whispered, rising quickly. "I didn't mean—" "Why?" His voice was rough, a whip of emotion. "Why that song?" "I found the sheet music among your things," she stammered. "It was beautiful. I thought—" "You thought to resurrect ghosts best left buried?" His tone made her flinch, but she stood her ground. "No, Your Grace. I thought perhaps they were never meant to haunt you, only to remind you that love once lived here." Her words fell like gentle rain on the fire of his anger. For a long moment, neither spoke. The Duke's chest rose and fell as if struggling against invisible chains. Then, slowly, he turned away. "Do not touch this piano again," he said quietly. "Do not speak of her. Do not try to mend what war and death have already claimed." Evelina lowered her gaze, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "You can forbid my hands, Alaric," she murmured, "but not my prayers." She left the room, her skirts brushing the dust, leaving him standing in the half-light of a memory that refused to die. He stared at the piano long after she had gone. The silence that followed was unbearable, not peaceful, not soothing, but aching. His reflection in the black lacquer looked like that of a stranger. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked past the chapel and stopped at the door. Through the small crack, he saw her kneeling again. The candlelight bathed her in gold, her lips moving soundlessly. "Why?" he whispered to himself. "Why does she still pray for me?" As if in answer, a sudden gust of wind slipped through the corridor and snuffed out one of the candles by his side, leaving him in darkness. But from the chapel came a single, unwavering glow. Hers. He turned away before it could undo him. Yet the warmth of that light lingered in his mind all night, chasing away the cold edges of his dreams. And for the first time in years, when dawn broke over Winthorpe Manor, the Duke did not wake with dread. He woke remembering a voice, not his fiancée's, not the screams of the dying, but Evelina's soft promise. Not everything that dies must stay dead. The night it happened, the manor slept under a thin veil of fog, that strange, ghostly quiet that follows a day too heavy for peace. The moon hung low, pale and uncertain, casting silver streaks across the great marble halls of Winthorpe. Every window shimmered faintly, like glass caught between two worlds. Alaric couldn't sleep. Sleep had long abandoned him. It came only in cruel fragments, bringing with it the smell of smoke, the thunder of guns, the faces of the fallen. He'd tried whiskey. He'd tried prayer once, long ago, but found no God who cared to answer a soldier's grief. Tonight, though, something stirred in him, a pull, not from within, but from somewhere deeper in the house, a sound, soft, faint, familiar. He followed it down the dark corridor, his cane tapping rhythmically against the stone, echoing like a heartbeat. As he drew closer, he realized what it was. A voice. Her voice. It came from the chapel. The door was slightly ajar, the golden spill of candlelight warming the cold passage beyond. He paused at the threshold, unseen, and watched. Inside, Evelina knelt before the altar, her hair unbound, her nightgown simple and pale against the deep crimson of the carpet. Before her, the single candle she always kept burning flickered gently, throwing shadows over her face. He meant to turn away. Truly, he did. But her words caught him, low, trembling, achingly sincere. "Lord, If his heart has forgotten how to love, teach mine to be patient enough to remind him. The Duke's breath hitched. He stood frozen in the doorway, every muscle tense. If he cannot hear joy in the world, she continued, her voice breaking, let him hear peace in the silence, and if he can no longer believe in forgiveness, let him borrow mine. The quiet that followed was unbearable. She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, and if I am to love him alone, then let me do so without bitterness. Something inside him fractured. He had heard confessions before, soldiers crying out to heaven, begging for mercy that never came. But this was different. This was not desperation. It was love stripped bare, humble and unguarded. He stepped forward once, almost without realizing, the floor creaking beneath his boot. Evelina turned slightly, startled. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing there, half-shadowed, half-illuminated, like a ghost she'd summoned by prayer. "Your Grace," she breathed, rising quickly, wiping at her cheeks. "I didn't hear you." He stood there, silent, unable to trust his own voice. "I was only," she hesitated, glancing back toward the altar, "praying." "For me?" he asked finally. Her lips parted, but she didn't look away. "Always." The single word cut through him like a blade, not sharp, but deep. He moved closer, the candlelight washing over his face, revealing the faint lines beneath his eyes, the exhaustion carved into his very bones. "You waste your prayers," he said, though the words trembled. "No prayer for love is ever wasted," she whispered. Something flickered behind his eyes, pain, defiance, longing, all colliding at once. He turned his gaze to the small wooden cross above the altar. "I stopped believing in mercy the day the world took it from me." "And yet," she said softly, "mercy still found its way back to you, through the door, in the rain." He blinked, stunned by the simplicity of her truth. They stood there, the air thick with something unspoken, grief, love, maybe both. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to tell her how much her voice had haunted him in the trenches when he thought he was dying. But the words caught behind his teeth. Finally he managed, "You deserve more than this, more than a man who cannot even say the word love without feeling it like a wound." She stepped closer, her eyes glistening, her voice steady. "Then let me be your healing, Alaric, not your punishment." He turned sharply, breaking eye contact, afraid that if he didn't, the fortress inside him would crumble completely. "You shouldn't wait for what will never come." Her answer came without hesitation. "I already have." He looked at her one last time before leaving, the candlelight flickering in her eyes like stars refusing to go out. When he reached his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not despair, but hope. And as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, he realized something he hadn't dared believe since the war. The woman downstairs wasn't praying for him. She was praying him back to life. The following day dawned gray and restless, the kind of morning that smelled of rain and unfinished confessions. The sea winds rolled across the cliffs, making the windows of Winthorpe Manor shudder in their frames. Alaric hadn't slept. The echo of Evelina's voice had followed him through every hour of darkness, her prayer replaying in his mind like a song he couldn't silence. If he can no longer believe in forgiveness, let him borrow mine. Those words clung to him more fiercely than the ghosts of the war ever had. He tried to distract himself. Letters from the Ministry of War lay unopened on his desk, reports demanding his attention. The ink blurred as he stared at them, unfocused. It was no use. His thoughts always returned to her, to the chapel, to the way her voice trembled yet never broke. He rose abruptly, pacing. Every footstep sounded like accusation. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating quiet, he left his study and sought her out, perhaps to confront her, perhaps to silence her faith before it undid him completely. He found her in the rose garden, kneeling among the thorns. The air smelled of rain and earth. Her skirts were damp from dew, her hands smudged with soil. She looked up as he approached and smiled. "You shouldn't be out here," he said sharply. "It's going to storm." "I don't mind the rain," she replied softly, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "Things grow better after it." The simplicity of her answer stung more than he expected. He folded his arms. You speak of storms as if they're blessings, but not all of them bring life, Evelina. Some destroy. She looked at him, then really looked, past the title, past the scars. Then tell me, Alaric, she said quietly, what destroyed you? For a moment he said nothing. The wind pressed between them, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. Finally, he whispered, Love did. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. Love didn't kill her, Alaric. War did. He turned sharply, jaw tightening. War, fate, God, take your pick. But love was the reason I let myself believe she'd survive it. Love made me weak. I will not let it make me a fool again. Is that what you think I am? Her voice wavered slightly, though her eyes remained steady. A fool for loving you? He froze. The question hung in the air, like lightning waiting to strike. She stood, her palms brushing against her skirt. You don't have to love me back, she said. I never prayed for that. I only prayed that you would stop punishing yourself for being alive. Alive? His voice rose, not in anger, but anguish. Do you know what living feels like, Evelina? It's waking up every day wishing you hadn't survived. It's hearing a voice in your head that you can't silence, a promise you couldn't keep. You call that living? The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy. She didn't move. Then maybe you've forgotten what it means to live, she said quietly. He turned to leave, to flee from the way her words dug too deep, but she caught his arm. Her hand was small, trembling, yet it stopped him more effectively than any command. I don't need the man you were, she said, tears mingling with rain. I only need the man standing before me, even if he's broken, even if he's afraid. He stared at her, rain dripping from his hair, his chest heaving. Every word she spoke stripped away another layer of his defenses until only the truth remained, raw, bleeding, undeniable. You think your prayers can change me? He asked, his voice low, trembling. She met his gaze, unflinching. No, she said softly, but love might. Lightning split the sky behind them. For one suspended second, everything stood still, the garden, the rain, even time itself. Then he stepped back, his voice breaking. You should not love me, Evelina. I'll only ruin you. She shook her head, rain plastering her hair to her face. You can't ruin what's already been redeemed. He looked at her, something wild and pained flickering in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps vanishing into the storm. Evelina stood alone, soaked to the bone, her hands clasped tightly around the silver locket she wore, the one that still held a lock of his hair. She lifted her face to the rain, whispering a single sentence that the thunder barely carried away. Then I will pray until you believe you're worth loving. The storm came harder than the valley had seen in years. By nightfall, the heavens had split open. Wind shrieked through the chimneys of Winthorpe Manor, and rain hammered against the windows with the fury of a world unwept. Servants scurried to bar the shutters, lightning flickered over the moors like veins of fire, and the air itself felt charged with a kind of warning. Evelina stood by her window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She had not seen Alaric since the confrontation in the garden. He had left before the thunder rolled in, taking his horse down the coastal road that curved along the cliffs, the same path that had claimed his fiancée years ago. Every strike of lightning made her chest tighten. Every rumble of thunder seemed to whisper the same question. What if he doesn't come back this time? When an hour passed with no sign of him, her worry turned to dread. She threw on her cloak and ran down the grand staircase, her steps echoing like heartbeats in an empty cathedral. Lady Winthorpe, Mrs. Holloway called after her. The roads are flooded. I have to find him, Evelina shouted, pushing through the heavy front doors into the rain. The world outside was chaos. The wind tore at her hood, the rain blinded her, and the path was little more than mud and shadow. But she pressed on, calling his name into the storm, her voice breaking against the roar of the sea. Alaric, please, Alaric. Far in the distance, lightning flashed, and for an instant, she saw a dark figure on horseback, struggling against the gale. He was heading toward the cliffs. She ran harder. Her boots slipped on the wet stones, her skirt clung to her legs, the wind cutting into her skin like ice. She didn't feel the pain, only fear. When she reached the ridge, she saw him dismounted, fighting to calm his horse. The animal reared, panicked by thunder, and Alaric shouted, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Alaric!" she cried, stumbling toward him. He turned, shock flashing in his eyes. "Evelina, what are you doing here?" But before she could answer, the ground beneath her gave way. The rain had loosened the soil near the cliff's edge. The earth crumbled beneath her feet. She gasped as she slipped, her hands clawing for purchase. For one heart-stopping moment, the world tilted, and the roar of the sea below swallowed everything. Then, his hand. Alaric lunged forward, catching her wrist just as her foot disappeared over the ledge. The force nearly pulled him down with her, but he dug his boots into the mud, muscles straining. "Hold on!" he roared. "Don't let go!" Her eyes met his through the rain, wide and terrified. "You came back," she whispered. "Always," he gasped. "Now hold." He pulled with all the strength left in him. Pain shot through his arm, but he didn't care. Inch by inch, he dragged her upward until she collapsed against him, trembling and soaked. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain fell harder, wind howling around them like a chorus of ghosts. Then, without thinking, he crushed her to his chest. "Don't ever do that again," he whispered fiercely, his voice breaking. "Don't you ever—" She clung to him, sobbing. "I thought I lost you." He drew back enough to look at her face, mud-streaked, rain-soaked, utterly alive. Something inside him broke open then, completely and irrevocably. The fear, the guilt, the vow never to love, all of it shattered beneath the realization that he could not survive losing her too. "You fool," he whispered, cupping her face in trembling hands. "You prayed for me when I didn't deserve it. You waited when I wasn't worth waiting for, and still you came for me." Lightning flared behind them, a jagged crown of white fire across the sky. His voice was a rough confession torn from the heart. "I can't lose you, Evelina, not you." Her eyes softened through her tears. "Then stop running from what's already yours." He froze, the truth in her words hitting harder than any cannon fire he'd ever faced. For the first time in years he felt it, not the cold ache of survival, but the heat of being alive. The storm raged on, but something gentler had taken root inside him, fragile, trembling, but real. When they returned to the manor, soaked and breathless, he didn't let go of her hand. Not once. That night, long after she'd fallen asleep beside the fire, Alaric sat beside her, his head bowed, her fingers still in his. The words he hadn't dared speak in years escaped him in a whisper, meant for the quiet only love could hear. "If there is mercy left in this world, let her be my redemption." And somewhere beyond the storm, dawn began to break. By morning, the storm had spent its rage. What remained was a quiet so deep it almost felt holy. The manor stood still beneath a washed sky, its gardens bruised and silvered with dew. Birds perched hesitantly on broken branches, testing the silence that followed the night's fury. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth of Alaric's chamber. Evelina lay pale but breathing on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her hair drying in loose curls across her shoulders. The faint rise and fall of her chest was the most precious sound he had ever heard. Alaric sat beside her, unshaven, eyes red from sleeplessness. His hands that once commanded battalions, now trembled as they adjusted the blanket around her. Every few minutes, his gaze would dart to her face, as if to reassure himself that she was still there, still breathing, still his to protect. He had almost lost her. Again. Just as he had lost Marion, just as he had lost everything. But this time, the thought carved something new inside him, not despair, but terror of what that loss would mean. He had not prayed in years, not since the trenches. But last night, kneeling in the mud with her limp against his chest, he had begged the heavens like a desperate man. And the heavens, for reasons he could not fathom, had listened. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Holloway whispered from the doorway, holding a tray. He turned sharply. "Not now," he said, his voice low, frayed. "She needs to eat," the woman insisted gently. "When she wakes, I'll see to it," he said more softly. "Thank you." The housekeeper hesitated, then left. When the door clicked shut, Alaric leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. The warmth stung his face. The memory of her hand slipping from his grip haunted him like a phantom. And then, a sound. Alaric! Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. He turned at once. She stirred, her lashes fluttering against her cheeks before her eyes opened slowly, unfocused. "I'm here," he said quickly, reaching for her hand. "You're safe." Her lips curved weakly. "You found me." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I nearly didn't." A faint smile touched her mouth. "I prayed you would." He closed his eyes briefly. Her words struck him harder than any blow. When he looked at her again, his mask, the cold composure he had built over years of pain, had cracked completely. "You should have hated me," he murmured. "You should have let me go to the sea and never returned." "I could never," she whispered, "not while I still believe there's light in you." He laughed then, a rough, broken sound. "Light? Evelina, I'm made of ruin. Everything I touch turns to ash. I swore to never love again, because love is what kills what I care for." Her hand lifted, trembling, to his face. She brushed away the rain-streaked dirt from his cheek with infinite gentleness. "Then stop calling it ruin," she said. "Start calling it life." He froze under her touch. No one had touched him like that since before the war, with care, without pity. His vision blurred, and before he realized, tears were falling freely, hot against her fingers. Her breath caught, eyes wide. "Alaric!" He tried to turn away, ashamed. "Forgive me," he whispered, voice breaking. "I don't even know who I am anymore." She cupped his face in both hands, pulling him gently toward her. "You're my husband," she said. "That's who you are." His forehead fell against hers. "You prayed for me when I didn't deserve it. I prayed because I couldn't live in a world without you." The words undid him completely. His hands found hers, holding tight as though anchoring himself to something real for the first time in years. "Evelina," he whispered, her name a confession in itself. "I can't promise I'll ever be whole. I can't promise I won't wake screaming. But if there is a part of me left to love you, it's yours." She smiled faintly, tears gathering in her eyes. "Then it's already more than I ever prayed for." Outside, sunlight began to break through the clouds, a slow bloom of gold over the sea. The light poured into the room, catching on the tear that still lingered on his cheek. He looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time since the war, the silence inside him didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like peace. And when he pressed his lips to her forehead, it wasn't out of duty or guilt. It was love, quiet, trembling, reborn. The days that followed were like the first breaths after a long drowning. The storm was gone, but its memory lingered in every puddle, every bent branch, every golden shaft of sunlight that fell across the grounds of Winthorpe Manor. Yet within those same walls that had once echoed only with silence, something living began to stir again. Alaric Blackwell, the Duke who had once walked through his days like a ghost, was changing. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A sound here, a gesture there. The faint hum of a tune under his breath as he passed through the corridor. The way he paused by the window in the mornings, eyes lifted toward the horizon as though waiting for something other than duty to greet him. The servants noticed first. They exchanged glances in the kitchens when he thanked them, genuinely thanked them, for their work. He spoke softly now, his temper gentled, his gaze no longer burdened with the cold weight of command. "His Grace smiled today," one whispered. Smiled. Mrs. Holloway, who had managed the household since before the war, merely nodded. "It's her," she said. "The Duchess has done what none of us could." Upstairs, in the library, Evelina stood beside Alaric as he unpacked a small, dust-covered chest. Inside were the remnants of another life, a violin case, letters tied in silk, and a child's sketch of a man in uniform holding a woman's hand. He traced the drawing with his finger, then glanced at her. "I thought if I locked these away I could bury the pain." She looked at him gently. "And did you?" He shook his head. "No, I only buried myself." Her hand brushed his. "Then let's bring you back." And so they did. Each day, piece by piece, the Duke returned to life. He rode his horse again, not to chase ghosts along the cliffs, but to feel the wind on his face. He began reading aloud by the fire with Evelina beside him, her laughter soft as spring rain. He walked the gardens he had once abandoned, planting rose cuttings where the earth had gone dry. One morning, Evelina found him in the music room, the same place that had been locked since the war. The piano cover was open, dust scattered like snow across the keys. "Do you know this song?" he asked. Her heart caught. "It's your mother's waltz." He nodded. "She used to play it when I was a boy. I'd forgotten how it felt. To hear something beautiful without fear." He began to play, slowly at first, hesitantly, like a man learning to speak after years of silence. The melody filled the room, rich and full, and Evelina felt tears sting her eyes. "You haven't lost your touch," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I just needed a reason to play again." From that day forward, the manor itself seemed to awaken with them. Curtains were drawn open, fires burned in every hearth, servants began singing as they worked. The sound of laughter, her laughter, rang through the halls once haunted by grief. Evelina often found herself watching Alaric from afar, the way his shoulders no longer carried the same weight, the quiet peace that had settled over his features. He was still scarred, still haunted in places the eye couldn't see, but there was warmth now. Warmth she had fought for, prayed for, and won. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sea in gold, Alaric came to her in the garden. The roses they'd planted together were beginning to bloom. "You've given this place life again," he said, his voice quiet. She smiled, brushing dirt from her gloves. "It wasn't me. It was you, Alaric. You just needed to remember who you were before the war." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "No," he said softly. "I needed to remember who I could be after it." The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of salt and roses. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world felt still, suspended in that delicate place between past and promise. "I used to think love was a battlefield," he murmured, "something to be fought and won." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her then, eyes clear and steady. "Now I know it's the peace that follows." When he kissed her, slow, reverent, trembling, it wasn't the act of a man seeking redemption. It was gratitude made flesh. The Duke, who once vowed never to love again, had found something greater than forgiveness. He had found grace. And as the sun slipped behind the sea, Evelina realized that love, once awakened, never truly sleeps again. The morning of their vow renewal dawned with a golden hush over Winthorpe Manor. Sunlight streamed through the high windows of the chapel, scattering soft light upon marble floors that had known only shadows for far too long. The bells tolled once, twice, each note rolling across the cliffs like a heartbeat returning to life. It had been exactly 1 year since the Duke of Winthorpe returned from war. 1 year since Evelina had found him drowning in grief and silence. Now, those same halls that had once whispered of loss were filled with laughter, music, and flowers in bloom. The chapel was modest, adorned not with grandeur, but with sincerity. White roses, ivy, and candles that flickered like living prayers. The servants gathered quietly along the walls, their faces alight with pride and affection. Mrs. Holloway dabbed her eyes with a lace kerchief. "Never thought I'd see this day," she murmured to the butler beside her. At the altar stood Alaric Blackwell, dressed not in the stark black of mourning, but in a tailored coat of deep navy. The scars that once made him flinch under light now seemed to belong there, badges of a man who had lived, lost, and risen again. His eyes, once hollow, now held a depth that was both powerful and tender. And then she appeared. Evelina entered quietly, her gown simple but radiant, the lace at her sleeves catching the sunlight like spun gold. A faint flush warmed her cheeks as every gaze turned to her, not in judgment, but in awe. The woman who had once arrived at the manor as a governess now walked its chapel as a duchess, her every step a quiet act of grace. When she reached him, Alaric took her trembling hands and held them as though he were holding something sacred. "You look at me," he said softly, "as if I am worth something more than I deserve." She smiled. "Because you are." The priest began to speak, his voice a gentle echo in the vaulted chamber, yet to the couple standing before him, The world seemed to fade until only the two of them remained, two souls bound not by duty, but by everything they had survived. When it came time to speak, Alaric did not read the vow prepared for him. Instead, he reached into his coat and unfolded a worn page, one that looked as though it had crossed both time and battlefields. "This," he said, his voice unsteady, "was the letter I never sent. I wrote it the night I thought I would not live to see morning." He looked at her then, eyes glistening. "I wrote, 'If I die tomorrow, tell her I am sorry. Tell her I was too afraid to love her as she deserved. Tell her my silence was not cruelty, but cowardice. Tell her that if there is a world beyond this one, I will find her there.'" The chapel fell silent. Evelina's tears shimmered like dew. "But I lived," he continued softly. "And because of you, Evelina, I no longer live in silence. You found the man I had buried beneath grief. You taught me that love is not weakness. It is the only kind of courage that lasts." He folded the paper, placed it in her hands, and whispered, "I give you this now, not as a letter of farewell, but as a promise of forever." Evelina could not speak at first. Her heart was too full, but when she did, her words carried like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "You once told me love was dangerous," she said, "that it destroys those who dare to hope. But you were wrong, Alaric. Love doesn't destroy, it rebuilds, and I will spend every day proving that to you." When the priest declared them bound once more, the Duke did not wait for formality. He pulled Evelina into his arms and kissed her, not with desperation, but with devotion. The guests applauded. Mrs. Holloway openly wept. And as the choir began a soft hymn, Alaric whispered against her lips, "You prayed for my return. I think your prayer brought me home." Later, as the sun set beyond the cliffs, they stood together on the terrace overlooking the sea. The waves crashed below, the same sea that had once seemed endless and cruel. But now, beneath, the pink and gold sky, it looked almost kind. Evelina leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you think peace lasts?" she asked quietly. He looked down at her, his hand finding hers. "No," he said gently, "but love does, and that's enough." As the wind carried the scent of roses and salt, the Duke, who had vowed never to love again, drew his wife close, and for the first time in his life he felt not like a man haunted by war, but like a man reborn by love.